Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 2 of our story tonight. And love to each and every one of you, and big hugs. And before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And we are learning in this story about a woman called Nora, who's got a very strong hold over her grandson and wants to move to the Colorado countryside. And we've gone back in time in the story to find out what a disagreeable woman this Nora Trevelli actually is. She's very possessive. She was very possessive about her doll growing up. She's clearly very possessive about her grandson Dustin. And her parents are discussing the problems with Nora going back in time. So let's continue with the story. I hate to say this to you, Gabe, and point the blindingly obvious, but there have been so many incidents over the years regarding our Nora that have left me feeling very perturbed and upset. Do you remember when Pastor Allen, bless his cotton socks, came to dinner that night? There was a great big fat green caterpillar wiggling around on his plate, which wasn't there when I served up the meal to him. The thing was gargantuan. I don't think I've ever seen such an enormous caterpillar. There is no way I would have missed a caterpillar of that size. The thing was the size of a small sausage. I remember the incident very well, love, said Gabe, chuckling. It was hilariously funny, you have to admit it. Especially to see the huge caterpillar wiggling around on Pastor Allen's plate. And his expression. Well, it was impossible to keep a straight face. Especially when the large caterpillar began eating the lettuce on the side of his plate, next to the lasagna. Well, I'm glad you found it amusing, Gabe. I certainly wasn't laughing. Poor Pastor Allen. He was a guest in our home, an honorary guest for that matter. And as his hosts, I wanted us to show him a good time in our home. But Nora ruined the whole dining experience for us. For the record, Gabe, that big fat ugly caterpillar made a miraculous appearance when Nora took the pastor's plate from me to present to him. What are you implying, love? Asked Gabe, raising a silvery brow. Why do I have a funny feeling I know where this is going? You're so predictable, love. You're going to blame Nora, aren't you, for putting the fat green caterpillar on the pastor's plate? I'm sure she wouldn't do that, love. And even if she did do it, is it such a big deal, really? Please, Gabe, I hate it when you're in denial like this. And for your information, yes, it is a very big deal. You don't know your daughter well enough, it's clear to me. I can assure you, Gabe, that Nora deliberately parked that caterpillar on Pastor Allen's plate. And whether you found it amusing or not is beside the point. It was not a nice thing for her to do. Gabe shrugged his shoulder. All this fuss about a caterpillar. Isn't that a tad ridiculous, love? The thing was harmless. The incident was funny. Can't we put this behind us? Do we need to harp over events like this that border on the ridiculous and the insane? No, we can't put this behind us, Gabe. I know you want to believe Nora is sweetness and light, but I was the one that washed the lettuce thoroughly that night. If that enormous caterpillar had been in the lettuce, I would have found him. I could see the delighted smirk on Nora's face when the pastor visibly squirmed. I've never been so embarrassed and humiliated in my entire life. Even when I served the pastor a new plate of lasagna, he never ate terribly much. I can't blame him for that. I'm sure he was put off anything I served him up after that. God knows what the poor man was thinking. He was probably terrified of dessert, not knowing what was going to meet him on his dessert plate. What are you trying to say, love? You are not being very kind about Nora. You're immediately assuming she's behind all of this. But she is, Gabe. She is. Don't you get that? She's got you wrapped around her little finger. But you need to know what she's really like. She's got a macabre sense of satisfaction from doing things like that. I can see it in her eyes. She loves to set the cat among the pigeons and cause discord wherever she goes, without people ever knowing that she's the one that set the whole thing up in the first place. She clandestinely covers her tracks well, but I'm not fooled, Gabe, for a moment, even if you are. I despair of her, Gabe, I really do. God forbid if she doesn't like you. You don't want to make an enemy out of our daughter. Oh, for goodness sake, love. You're taking this far too far. Our daughter's only a teenager. How much harm can a teenager do? That daughter of ours deliberately breaks things of mine if I upset her, and I know she does. Suddenly I'll find something that she's purposely smashed, and I'll know she did it intentionally, to get her back at me. Oh, love, I wish you wouldn't say things like that. You don't know that for sure. But I do, Gabe, I do. Remember when I said she couldn't go to Kiki's house the one day? The next day I found that perfect white dress I'd bought from the boutique in town, that cost me an arm and a leg, was covered in a red wine stain on the front. Now how did it get there, Gabe? It was Nora. I know it was. Deny it as much as you like, but I know what that girl is capable of. I refused her to go, and she wanted me to know that she would get her back on me, and she did. And I loved that dress, Gabe. I really did. You're reading far too much into this, love. Honestly, I don't think Nora's that mean. I don't think she would deliberately set out to hurt you like that. Maybe you accidentally spilled the wine on your dress when you were hanging it up in your wardrobe. You often drink wine in the bedroom, don't you? There's probably a simple explanation to what happened. That is where you're wrong, love, Molly Trevelli had replied rather curtly. I wish you weren't so deceived by our daughter, Gabe. She's pulled the wool right over your eyes, as she's done for many people in her life. But Kiki knows what she's like, and I think underneath it you do too, Gabe. I've been watching our daughter. There's a side to her personality that completely lacks empathy. I think Nora is a narcissist who takes pleasure in upsetting people if she believes they've done her wrong. And even if they haven't, in some warped, satisfying way, she gets her kicks from causing disquiet. I feel afraid of Nora at times, Gabe, I really do. I'm scared of being angry with her, in case she does something mean out of spite to get her back on me. I can't trust her to behave. Honestly, love, I don't like to say this, but I'm going to say it. I think you're being unreasonably hard on our daughter. Nora is a good girl, really. She's had her moments, of course she has, like many teenagers do. I mean, let's not kid, teenagers are notorious for having a reputation of giving their parents loads of grief. And a turbulent ride, and Nora has done that extremely well. She's not the first in that regard, and I dare say she will not be the last. It would seem that Gabe was stubbornly refusing to admit that they had a problematic child. Maybe as a father, he saw speaking badly about one of his children as a betrayal. But deep down in her gut, Molly knew Gabe knew the truth about Nora. I blame myself, Gabe. In fact, I blame the both of us. We are responsible for how Nora has turned out as her parents. We let her get away with far too much because she was the late lamb in our family. And look what she's turned into, Gabe. A monster. That's what. I hate to say this to you, love, but I don't like Nora very much. In fact, I don't like her at all. I love her because as her mother I'm expected to love her, and she is my daughter by blood. But like her? No, I don't like her at all. I think you expect me to be shocked with your saying this, that you don't like your daughter. But I can assure you I'm not shocked at all. Many parents speak this way of their teenagers. But whatever is irking you now with Nora, I'm sure we'll both get through it. And one day Nora will surprise you when she becomes a fine young woman. Just give her time. That's all I'm asking you. Gabe, you don't see what I see. You're completely clueless. I wish you weren't, I really do. Unfortunately, our Nora has charmed the socks off you. You melt like butter when she asks you to do anything for her. None of our other children have had such a hold over you. Think about it, Gabe. Our daughter's behaviour has never been normal. Look, love, you really do need to calm down. I'm getting tired of this conversation. It's starting to bore me silly. You must begin to realise that our daughter is a teenager. She gives us a few problems, that's all. But it's perfectly natural. There's nothing wrong with our girl. You need to get that idea right out of your head. Molly Trevelli had not been wrong about her brutally honest assessment of her daughter Nora, but getting Gabe to agree about this was close to impossible. The man, like so many people she knew, was so stubbornly in denial. She might as well quit while she was ahead, or they'd end up having an ongoing argument that would probably never reach a climax. She had known all too well that regretfully, sometimes in a bird's nest, a bad egg has been laid, and no matter what you may do to help it hatch out right, some things are meant to be bad. Just like when you crack open an egg to use in a cake recipe, or to make an omelette, and you realise it's gone off. There's not a thing you can do to redeem the egg. The only thing you can do is throw it out, for it is good for nothing, and is past saving. Let's just say if you got on Nora Trevelli's wrong side, getting ill would be the last of your concerns, as the wrath of that girl could not be underestimated, and this is what Molly Trevelli had come to realise about her daughter. All these years later, after the undulating ups and downs of Nora's tempestuous childhood and her rather challenging teenage years, where she'd brought much grief to her parents, most particularly her mother. These days Nora herself was now a grandmother, who was extremely besotted and devoted over her grandson Dustin, and would never have had a bad word said about him. But unlike Nora Trevelli, Dustin was a good boy, with not a nasty bone in his body, a far cry from his grandmother in that regard. Suffice to say, Nora had never married, but had become pregnant with her daughter Kendall when she was 19 years old, much to the shock horror of both Molly and Gabe Trevelli. Even Gabe Trevelli had been forced to admit that this time Nora had gone too far, as it reflected very badly on the Trevelli family, who were considered upstanding citizens in their community. A scandal like this could easily destroy their family's glowing reputation. At such a harrowing time, only a couple of generations back, having a baby out of wedlock ultimately brought much shame on the entire family. It certainly would have done so for the Trevellis, and they couldn't have that happen to them. Many parents placed in similar taxing circumstances would be forced to go to extreme measures to cover up what had happened to their teenager. They would secretly squirrel their pregnant teenager away to have their child in a special private place designed for young mothers, usually a convent of some sort, so that prying eyes would not know about their dirty family secret. Regretfully for many, the truth would sometimes come out, and the gossiping and unkind words would become rife. Likewise, Molly Trevelli had covered up her daughter's pregnancy well, and after Kendall was born, Molly raised Nora's daughter as her very own. Molly Trevelli and her husband Gabe had masterfully managed to curtail the wagging tongues in town, as Mrs. Trevelli was still young enough to have had a late child, although she'd sworn after Nora was born that there would be no more children. But for her, raising her grandchild had been an absolute pleasure. Molly Trevelli had gone around town wearing a fake baby bump for the duration of the full 9 months, ensuring it got bigger at the right time, so that no one suspected a single thing. It helped, of course, that Molly Trevelli was a natural actress, so she convinced many that she was indeed pregnant. Keeping Nora's pregnancy cloak and dagger had not been easy by any manner of means, but Molly Trevelli had it all under control, and she refused to allow their family name to be dragged through the mud. Gabe Trevelli had sent Nora to Italy to spend time with his Italian relatives, where Nora stayed with both of his parents in their rustic farmhouse, where they grew groves of oranges and lemons for a living. Everyone in town thought Nora had gone to Italy to learn to speak Italian, so that one day she'd be fluent and be able to work for the Italian embassy. And she did return from Italy, completely fluent as it happens in the language, and so having a second language under her belt had seemed like a good reason for her to have gone away. She had enjoyed her time in Italy, and did at one point consider emigrating, but then decided against it. She decided she'd rather stay in America. The locals brought the lie without knowing that the Trevelli family had a dark secret that they had shrouded from their eyes, and they had been completely hoodwinked. By all accounts, even the boy that had made Nora pregnant had no knowledge that he was the father, which is just the way the Trevelli family wanted to keep it. Kendall was born in Italy. She was delivered in Nora's relative's farmhouse, where a midwife had been brought to help with the delivery. She had encouraged Nora to have a water birth, which was unusual for the time, but was growing in popularity among the unconventional types, who liked to do things rather differently. When Nora returned home to Denver with a little bundle in her hands, she surreptitiously handed it over to her mother, who claimed to have birthed Kendall herself. Kendall was born a healthy 7 pounds and 3 ounces. She had bright, deep green eyes with flecks of hazel within them, and wisps of dark curly hair that was so typical of the Italian side of the family. Molly had fallen in love with the little baby from the moment she had laid eyes on her beloved grandchild. Kendall reminded her so very much of her husband Gabe. Everybody told Molly how lucky she was to have such a late child. Of course she played the part of the devoted mother incredibly well, which of course was not terribly hard to do, as she adored her grandchild. People were amazed how quickly Molly's enviably slimmed figure had bounced back after the pregnancy, when one day she appeared to have a large baby bump, and the next it had mysteriously gone, as if by magic. Some young mothers in the area began asking Mrs. Trevelli for dieting tips on how to lose the post-pregnancy weight, as quickly as she had done, which many described as nothing short of miraculous. Nora had felt no attachment or devotion to her baby girl Kendall. On the contrary, she had expressed very little interest in contributing to raising her own child, who she pretended to the world was her sister. Everyone brought into the duplicitous charade, hook, line and sinker, and Nora had liked it that way very much. She got a weird kind of satisfaction from deceiving the locals. She would regularly say to her mother, "How can people be so dim not to know that Kendall is really mine? It's bleedingly obvious, isn't it? Yet they still don't see it. It's hilarious how deceived people can be." Molly Trevelli would reply, "Well, I'd like to think, Nora dear, that people want to believe the best in us. Don't you?" "Whatever," Nora had replied, rolling her eyes in disgust. "I still say people are inherently stupid, when the truth is staring them blazingly in the face, and yet they don't see it." It was only Kiki, who was Nora's childhood friend, who knew the sordid truth about Kendall's mysterious arrival into the world. She also knew that saying anything to anyone in town about the matter would not be in her best interests, so she kept her mouth wisely shut, for she knew better than to upset Nora Trevelli, as the childhood event with her baby doll had burnt its way indelibly into her memory. Now that Nora was considerably older, Kiki suspected she was capable of far greater spite, but those were not waters she was willing to test under any circumstances. Only a fool would do that. She did, however, tell Nora what she knew. She wanted her best friend to know that she had not been so easily duped. "I know your mother was never pregnant with Kendall," she said defiantly. "Kendall is your baby, isn't she, Nora? I saw you. Don't forget, I saw you and Rolf at the party together. You were in his parents' bedroom while they were out. I knew you weren't playing a game of cards as you claimed you were. I'm not stupid. I wasn't born yesterday. You were getting up to all kinds of hanky-panky. I knew what you were up to, and even at the time I thought to myself, I hope she's being careful, because she might just fall pregnant, and it would be so typical if she did. And then all of a sudden, Lo and behold, before you have a chance to show, you hurriedly saunter off to Italy, claiming you want to learn Italian. I remember thinking to myself, oh my goodness, you have never shown any interest whatsoever in your Italian heritage. Now suddenly you want to learn Italian. Then your mother goes around town claiming to be pregnant with a baby bump. I didn't buy that for a single second. You come back home to Denver, having put on weight, and you said the weight gain was all due to the delicious Italian food you had consumed. But I knew that weight gain was not food-related. So what are you trying to say, Kiki? Spell it out, then. Well, your mother's baby bump, I know, was a prothesis. It was designed to deceive people. It wasn't convincing to me. One time it was hanging far too low. I watched your mother hurriedly retreat to the ladies' room, where she quickly corrected the blunder. I saw it all. Once your mother had claimed to have birthed Kendall, unlike other mothers who stay at home to actually recover from giving birth, because believe it or not, having a baby is an exhausting business. But the very next day, your mother is energetically walking around town with Kendall in her pram, a big beam on her face, so big it could sink the Titanic. She was showing Kendall off and was as proud as Punch, and I don't blame her, because Kendall's a beautiful little baby. But lo and behold, after her delivery, her stomach is as flat as a pancake, and that is not normal. Most people didn't figure it out, but I'm not stupid. I knew what had happened. Kiki's rather brusque comments had provoked Nora to anger. She grabbed Kiki by the scarf around her neck, holding it rather tightly, and said to her, "Don't you dare tell anybody about this, will you? Or you will regret it. Do you understand, Kiki?" Kiki had nodded. "Of course. I wouldn't dream of it." One look at the dark fury in Nora's soulless eyes told her that she'd need to keep her lips permanently sealed, if she knew what was good for her, as Nora made her feel terribly afraid when she became indignant, and it didn't do to provoke those porcupine-like spines of hers. Once Nora returned from Italy, she became significantly more tame. She went to university to acquire a BCom, and subsequently ended up making some sound financial investments, so that by the time she was 35 years old, her business savvy and entrepreneurial skills had made her a very wealthy young woman indeed. From an early age, Nora Trevelli had decided that she would never get married. She had no need of a man in her life. Men were surplus to requirements as far as she was concerned. But then again, she thought that about a lot of people in general. Whether they be men or women, it didn't really matter. Nora only ever went after what she needed, or what she deemed would be useful for her in her life. Anything else could be tossed away like the garbage. Nora never cared who she hurt or stepped on to get to her ultimate goal. People just did not matter. In her humble opinion, if she were to settle down and to get married, her husband would steal her independence away from her, robbing her of all her freedoms to live the selfish life she'd like to live. Nora didn't want to sacrifice anything for anyone. There was no doubt that she was an attractive woman. Her good looks had carried her through her teenage years, into her adulthood, serving her well. She had broken many men's hearts along the journey of life, but none of these men knew what a lucky escape they'd had from getting involved with such a treacherous woman like her, who might have your guts for garters, and wouldn't care if she broke your heart into smithereens. Even Nora's friend Kiki had privately wondered that if Nora had in fact married, whether she might have disposed of her husband and buried him under a vegetable patch, if he had made her mad enough. For she certainly believed Nora was capable of doing a wicked thing like this. Yet despite this, she still remained friends with Nora. She knew how to handle her friend. She could never understand why she still remained attached to her, but despite Nora's dark side, Kiki continued to genuinely love her. Even as a youngish grandmother, Nora would still receive admiring glances from mature men, but should they get any funny ideas, Nora would squat them away like the annoying flies on a window pane. She didn't want to be bothered by the affections and attentions from the opposite sex. She couldn't help it if she was an attractive woman, could she? Why should she hide her light under a bushel? Nora was slim with long lean legs and a petite waist. She walked with an elegant gait, and clothes always looked remarkably good on her, which was why when she was a teenager she'd actually done a stint of modelling for a teenage magazine, much to her parents' disapproval, because they didn't like her flaunting herself. But the magazine threw her out, after she called the photographer a lecherous jerk, and had run him down with some cutting derogatory words from that dirty mouth of hers that would have made a filthy diesel engine appear sparklingly clean. It would seem when Kendall was 18 years old that she had disappointed both Molly and Gabe Trevelli by falling pregnant at a similar age to Nora. It would seem history had repeated itself all over again. Kendall had given birth to a baby son she had called Dustin. Molly and Gabe Trevelli were not remotely amused by this fortuitous turn of events. They blamed themselves for what had happened. They had tried their level best to raise Kendall with the boundaries that they had failed to orchestrate in Nora's life. But despite everything, Kendall had replicated the mistakes of her own mother. Much to Molly and Gabe's surprise, Nora had been the one that rescued the situation, saving the day for the Trevelli family. She had vowed that she would take care of her baby grandson. She had insisted on taking Kendall to the clinic to organise birth control for her. And she had also persuaded her daughter to finish school and attend college, encouraging her to make something of her life. Nora had raised Dustin as her own, so that her daughter Kendall could thoroughly enjoy the independence of being a young adult without the responsibilities of childcare. The arrangement had worked out well for all concerned. Kendall loved her son, but was beginning to see Dustin as more like a brother rather than her own little boy. Nora wanted to keep it that way. She didn't want Kendall to assume a maternal role in Dustin's life. There was only one problem that was beginning to rear its ugly head rather too frequently. Nora Trevelli was extremely attached to her grandson, like she'd been to her doll Cindy when she was a young girl. Kendall had realised from her fleeting visits to see her son that Nora considered herself to be Dustin's true mother, and that if she got in the way of Nora's child-rearing, there would be hell to pay. Kendall didn't really care about this turn of events. As far as she was concerned, there was plenty of time later on in life to have children. She was far too busy to be a mother, and she was quite happy to look on Dustin as a brother, and the adorable little boy had appropriately begun to call her Sis. It was when Dustin was approaching his 13th birthday that Nora planned the big move to the countryside. It wouldn't be far from Denver, but far enough to keep people away, and that was what was really needed. She was tired of people, teachers and friends alike, annoyingly lavishing so much praise and attention on her grandson. She knew to keep their interest at bay, she should move away, especially before Dustin became interested in girls, which was a thought she was seriously beginning to dread. Nora had decided to buy an enchanting cabin and give her grandson the horse he'd been requesting. She would get Dustin to do his studies from home, so that their contact with the outside world would become significantly reduced. Of course, they would go to church regularly, every Sunday, and shopping in the rural town. But beyond that, Nora would keep a careful and studious eye over her grandson, which in her opinion was greatly needed, the way things had been going. She certainly wanted to keep Dustin safely by her side, as long as she drew breath. Kiki, her best friend, had not been adverse to telling Nora her thoughts on the matter. She was now, like Nora, in her early 40s, and had 2 children, who were now in college, but she was still Nora's best friend. "I know why you're moving away, Nora, from Denver, and just so you know, I think it's a bad idea." Nora became defensive. "What are you talking about, Kiki? Who says I even care about what you think? I'm doing this for Dustin's sake. It's good for a young man to grow up close to nature, to learn the responsibility of taking care of his own horse. This adventure will do him the world of good." "I'm sure you're right about that, Nora. Learning to look after his own horse will do him good. And of course it's healthy to be surrounded by such beguiling views and crisp air. But—" Nora sighed, rolling her eyes in the back of her head, glaring defiantly at Kiki, who didn't appear to be remotely ruffled. "Go on, say it, Kiki. Whatever it is, get it off your chest, why don't you?" "You love Dustin. I get it, Nora. I really do. But you do know that one day he's going to grow up and leave home.
He's 13 years old now, and you're messing his life up by deciding to move away. He's settled here. He's happy in Denver. Your point is, Kiki? This time it was Kiki who let out a sigh. She wasn't going to let Nora intimidate her. Some things needed to be said, and they needed to be spelt out. She needed to stick up for Dustin. The boy was growing up into a lovely young man, and Kiki had grown terribly fond of him over the years, so she had a right to express her misgivings. And now she really didn't care how Nora would react to them. You want to move Dustin away from Denver. It makes no sense. As I was saying, he's happy here. He's well-rounded. You're moving into the middle of the sticks, and homeschooling him is a bad idea. I'm sorry, but it is. He hasn't been brought up that way, Nora. He doesn't know anything about homeschooling. Now you want to change his whole lifestyle. I'm sorry, but this is absolute madness. There's nothing wrong with that, Kiki. A change of lifestyle never did anyone any harm. Maybe not, Nora, but I worry that Dustin may later resent you from distancing him from his friends. He's been going to school since he was a little kid. Now you're taking him away from the life he knows and loves. I'm not sure long-term it's a great idea. Dustin is such a lovely boy. He's popular. The teachers at the local school love him so much. He's clever, great at sports. I myself have grown terribly fond of him over the years. You've done a sterling job in raising him, Nora. He belongs here in Denver, though. Tearing him away from the only life he's ever known is just not fair on him. You need to think about Dustin here. It's not all about you, Nora, and what you want. You have a child to consider in all of this. Of course I know all that, snapped Nora. I'm not a complete imbecile, Kiki. I'm just saying. I'm worried you're getting attached to Dustin, Nora. Too attached. It's not healthy. You're quite possessive over him. When Dustin gets into his late teens, he won't be afraid to speak his mind out to you, Nora. And some of the things he might say won't be pretty. That's my bet. Don't be ridiculous, Kiki. You don't know what you're talking about. Nora moving away to a cabin in the middle of nowhere in the vain hope that you can distance Dustin from other people so that he stays with you indefinitely is not going to work long term. You do know that, don't you, Nora? Your Dustin is going to have ambitions. He's going to want to go to college one day, have kids of his own, finally get married. Nora raised her brow and said, I don't want Dustin to get married or to have children. I want him to stay with me in the cabin. And yes, if you must know, Kiki, that's exactly why we're moving. He'll soon realise that life is so very good with me. He'll never want to move away from his grandmother. The two of us are as thick as thieves, and that's the way it's going to stay, whether you like it or not, Kiki. Kiki shook her head sorrowfully. Nora, you know I love you, and I want what's best for you. You're making a big mistake, that's all I'm saying. You can't force the unnatural flow of life. It'll always dictate its own course. You have no control over it, you know, even if you think you do. Control is the one thing I have on my side, Kiki, I'll have you know. I have control over this whole thing. That's why I've planned it. Kiki inwardly squirmed. She knew that when Dustin got older, there would be significant problems. She could smell them on the wind. But her best friend's dogged refusal to listen to her sagacious advice would one day come back to haunt her. Of that Kiki was most sure. Dustin, I was 13 years old when Granny Nora insisted we move to the Colorado countryside, far away from our home in Denver, well, reasonably far away, to live in a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere, where she'd homeschool me. I don't want to go and live in a funny cabin somewhere. I want to stay here in Denver. I've got lots of friends here, haven't I? It'll be so boring living in a cabin. Besides, I've never been homeschooled before, Granny, I had protested. I really like going to school in Denver, being around my friends. I know all that, Dustin, and I understand where you're coming from. Believe me, I do. You may think you have a life that is good here in Denver, and I agree to an extent you do. But you're going to have it so much better where we're going.
You're going to thoroughly enjoy a much greater freedom and independence, something that all your schoolmates will surely envy. Most school children hate to endure the laborious, long-drawn-out monotony of a daily school day. I know I did when I was your age. I was always rebelling against school. I'd have been thrilled to death if my life had offered me so much more freedom. Why do you think so many children around the world play truant? They hate going to school and being subjected to all those dreadfully strict rules. You're going to absolutely love it where we're going. In truth, you're going to have the very best of both worlds, aren't you? You'll be able to come up to Denver to see your friends whenever you like. You can catch up with their news and so forth. We can come here as often as you want, and that's a promise, so you will not miss out on a single thing, will you? I'll give you my word on that.
But why do you want to move away, Granny Nora? I just don't get it. I told you I don't want to go far away from Denver. I don't mind going away on holidays because we always go back home afterwards. I really like living here in Denver. I don't want to move.
Well, I'm sorry you feel that way, Dustin. Really, I am. If you don't want us to leave Denver, we won't. But I fear you'll be missing out so very much.
What do you mean? I asked.
Well, I was going to keep it as a surprise, but I might as well tell you my plans. I was going to buy you a couple of horses that you could take care of yourself. Imagine that, Dustin. I know how much you love visiting the stables over the weekends to go horse riding. But none of those horses you ride belong to you, do they? They belong to the stables. Imagine owning your very own horse that you can personally take care of. We can get a couple of black Labradors and chickens and anything else you fancy besides. Anyway, you've always loved horses, haven't you? Imagine all the lovely riding you can do. You'll have the time of your life, going riding whenever you so wish, without being cruelly dictated to by an authoritative school curriculum that orders all the shots of your day. You can do as you please and fit in your studies when it suits you. It's a win-win situation, and I wouldn't mind betting most children would happily trade places with you any day of the week.
You mean if we move, I can have my own horse? I asked, my eyes widening in delight at the prospect of owning a horse. I could see myself riding on its back, down intrepid horse-riding trails, me and my horse against the entire world.
That's exactly what I mean, Dustin. I know how much horses mean to you. I'll get a stable block built for us and a little barn, and you can manage it all. It'll be your responsibility. And when I die, the cabin, the land, and everything else besides will be yours. I'll buy you a mountain bike, an ATV. You'll have all the quintessential accessories you love. I'll even buy you your own truck when you're ready to get your license. What do you think about that?
You're going to get me horses, I said, articulating the word in the open air, as if tasting its meaning on my tongue. My heart began to flutter wildly in my chest. My grandmother knew I loved horses. I had posters of horses all over my wall. Horses that had won the Grand National and other illustrious championships. I regularly went for horse riding lessons every weekend. My riding teacher, Rachel Munro, described me as a natural. I had won a line of rosettes in horse riding competitions, and these trophies were displayed in pride of place on my mantel. The thought of owning my own horse, that I was completely responsible for taking care of, tickled me pink, and changed the complete trajectory of my focus. Suddenly the idea of staying in Denver and going to school every day, under a drudgerously boring, restrictive daily routine, lost its glossy appeal. If I was living in a remote cabin with my grandmother, swaddled by the countryside, waking up to prepossessing views over the Colorado mountains every single day, what in the world could be better than that? I could spend hours with my horses, mucking out stables, going out on rides whenever I wanted. My grandmother would come on some of those rides with me, given she was a keen rider, and I knew the two of us could have so much fun together. I loved my grandmother with all my heart, as she had devoted her entire life to taking care of me, and I appreciated everything she had done, as growing up she had been my greatest cheerleader, who had denied me nothing, and if she believed the move was in our best interests, I wanted to grab this opportunity greedily with both of my hands. My mother Kendall had been a mere teenager when she had given birth to me. I considered Kendall more like a big sister to me than a mother. Without doubt, Granny Nora was the matriarch figure in my life, and was like a mother and grandmother rolled into one for me. She naturally influenced my decisions and the directions I took in my life. I always valued her instruction. She was far wiser than me. She had been successful at a very young age and retired early, while incurring a monthly income from all her investments. She had done something right in her life, and how many people can boast of such accomplishments? So listening to her sound advice was always a good idea. I knew moving to the countryside would mean I'd be able to embrace my studies to a schedule that conveniently suited me. My grandmother had promised me that she would teach me everything I would need to know. Beyond that, we could visit Denver regularly to catch up with my friends and family, so my resistance towards the move became rather thin. Of course, it goes without saying that I knew I would be sad to leave Denver and all my friends, but I had high hopes about the promising future that awaited me, like a bright sunrise spilled generously over the horizon in a splash of cheerful, engaging colours. So there we are. That's the end of part 2. Part 3 is tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.